Jim, thank you very much. It's a huge privilege and a pleasure to be here and to talk about prosperity without growth, which has been a sort of extraordinary process of launching a report. On the day, 2 days before it was launched, actually, I was walking home. It was about 7 o'clock at night, and I had a phone call. And I'm not going to relay too much of that phone call or tell you who it was from, except to perhaps relate that that person was rather irate to the extent that I had to hold the phone some distance from my ear. And the message that it conveyed to me was that number 10, and it was a street somewhere in London, with not again going to convey to you, had gone ballistic, which was really interesting. I mean, there were good reasons for number 10 to have gone ballistic, one of which was the unhappy accident we'd managed to launch Prosperity Without Growth in the week that number 10 had invited the G20 leaders to London to talk about the process of kick-starting growth. And obviously, as an advisor to the UK government, it could have been seen as bad form to launch this report in this week. Indeed, it was seen as very bad form. And the most extraordinary thing that happened on the back of it was that virtually nothing. 2 days later, on launch date, almost nothing happened. There was a resounding silence and still some resonant antagonism to what was seen as sort of sidelining a major political process. And yet in the interim, the kind of process of as Jim described, of sort of downloads and the taking of the message into different arena, including in about a month's time the UN. Anyone who has any tips on how I should relay this to the UN, please do come forward. I would be fascinated to hear them. Not something I'm approaching without trepidation, I have to say. It's been quite extraordinary in a way that the message has been so much taken up. And I think one of the reasons is that behind all the words, behind all the hype, behind all the complexity, behind the economic system, behind the economic collapse, behind our soul-searching about the future, lies a very, very simple conceptual truth, that an exponentially expanding subsystem of a finite system at some point has to hit the buffers. It has contained within it the seeds of its own collapse. It is not something that is physically possible. It's a conceptualization of the problem that even school children can understand with alacrity, this idea that we're living inside of a system that is exponentially expanding and that foresees its own future as exponentially expanding, and yet attempts to remain within ecological limits, is one that is readily graspable. And of course it is much more complex than that, and I'll talk about how it's much more complex than that. But at its heart, it's something that people do kind of understand. They almost have an innate sense that the spirit of a rampant consumerism on which we've built a decade and a half of actually quite good economic growth is not something that can go on and on in the way that the model predicts it'll go on. And they also have, I think one of the things I've come across a lot is a sense of, and I'll come back to this, a sort of sense of discontent, a latent discontent, a sense that actually another world is possible, to use language that doesn't necessarily, again, live in the mainstream. And that brings me, in a way, to my picture. I still don't know quite why this chair is here. It's something perhaps awaiting me to sit in quieter days and think about the plays that I haven't actually written over the last 2 years because I've been quite busy in this. But this idea, it captures for me a sort of visual image of a simplicity that actually is at the heart of people's yearnings for what the good life should be about. And again, there are many, many complications around that image. But the idea that we could live better by consuming less is one that, in the context of global ecological limits, is not one, perhaps, that we should give up lightly. The picture also, I finally discovered this morning, has another interesting feature, which is that it looks like someone's about to come and sit in it. And I was giving a presentation which was on video conferencing, actually with Scotland, Wales and London involved. And the fourth picture was this picture here. And actually, it was very difficult to get the meeting started because everyone was assuming that someone hadn't arrived yet and was going to be coming to listen from, I don't know, Greece or somewhere. It's not an expectation of arrival. It's just the visual image that I happened to pick up at some point and haven't quite let go of. Prosperity without growth. The idea of it has been the theme I should really have left that a little bit longer because somewhere along the line of my beautiful chair some logos got inserted there, and I just want to make sure that you've seen those. Many, many thanks to Queen's University Law School and to the Sustainable Development Commission. I'm not averse, of course, to logos, and there is, as you see, a little bit of advertising around the Earth Scan book. I'll come back again to that later. But the basic idea of prosperity without growth is to pitch that idea of unsustainability in the seeds, in the structure, in the foundations of the way that we live. And actually, very few people now would disagree with what I see as one horn in a very profound dilemma, the idea that growth is unsustainable. And of course, there are lots of people who will say, actually, well, it's unsustainable at the moment, but we could have a different form of growth. We could have a materially light growth, we could have a low carbon growth, we could have an economy that increasingly divorces itself from its own material implications. And that's something that is very, very important to consider. I'll come back to it. But nobody seriously disagrees with the fact that economic activity, as we know it at the moment, at the global level, is deeply unsustainable. It's depleting resources too fast, it's emitting carbon and greenhouse gases too fast, it's degrading land too fast, it's ruining biodiversity, water supplies and water quality are being degraded, and all of those challenges, immense challenges for governance, have come to haunt us in some sense, in spite of the fact that actually, at this point in time, we probably have to admit we don't know exactly how to make the economy work in its own terms either. So in other words, there's a kind of sense there of an impending, if not already existing, mess. And yet, so you would ask yourself, well, in the face of that, why don't we do anything different? And here's the other horn of the dilemma, and it is really, it's been encapsulated in the term, the possible alternatives have been encapsulated in the term degrowth. It's something that's come actually specifically out of France as an idea, and Serge Latouche, the notions of Serge Latouche, where it is called, in much more colourful and savoury terms, décroissance. Décroissance, s'il vous plaît. It certainly sounds as though it's something that you might want for breakfast. And interestingly, there's a battle over the words at the moment, which I can't quite understand, because degrowth, for me, is a very clunky sort of word, whereas décroissance certainly has a sort of sense of going somewhere to it and progress around it. But then that's the continual battle of the dominance of the English language, for which I can't really be an apologist. So I'll move on swiftly from that. But if you have a chance, promote décroissance, because it definitely sounds better to me. But décroissance may sound lovely, but it is degrowth by another name. And the other part of the fundamental dilemma of growth is this, that degrowth is unstable. And we see that no more profoundly than in the current climate, where once the economy starts to falter, the fear around economic collapse, and on the back of economic collapse, social collapse, really bites. It really serves to concentrate the political mind, the business mind, and indeed the minds of ordinary people who will find themselves possibly out of a job, out of a home, and possibly in situations where social structure itself is under threat. And there is good evidence to show that when economies collapse, if collapse is the inevitable outcome, bad things happen. And some of that evidence is convened in the report. I'm not going to go over it now. There are also some counterexamples, interesting places where economies have collapsed without social collapse, and they do have some quite interesting lessons to show how that occurs, how you defend social resilience in the face of an economic collapse is a really interesting question. But that, fundamentally, is the dilemma of growth. Growth is unsustainable, degrowth is unstable. And so we know both of these things. We've known them for decades. The question that leaps to the mind is, what is the official response to this, particularly in those nations who have accepted broadly that we need to do something about climate change, that we are living unsustainably, that our resource base is fragile. So what is the solution? And the main solution is the idea of decoupling. It's the idea that it's possible, in fact, to keep growth, to keep economic growth, to keep that thing that we know is important for stability, and yet for it to become lighter and lighter and lighter in material terms, to take the materials out of growth, to remove its dependency on polluting resources, to remove its dependency on carbon, to get it to a state where we can increase economic activity. It's an interesting question what those economic activities are. I'll come back to that. And yet to remove our damaging dependency on material resources and environmental emissions. So it's really important to say decoupling, what's the reality of that? And a lot of the report is about exploring that reality. Some of the report, statistics in the report are about exploring that reality. And I call this, the chapter in the report is called The Myth of Decoupling. And it's really important to notice that the myth of decoupling, the decoupling itself is incredibly important. It's clear that even at the scale that we have at the moment, it's absolutely vital to reduce the material dependency of the economy in that context. But what I'm referring to here, so decoupling itself very important. What I'm referring to here as the myth of decoupling is an idea that really has emerged through the technological optimism of the 1990s and concepts of ecological modernization, that actually our economies are going in that direction already. In fact, because they're capitalist economies, because we prize efficiency, our profit motive itself will mean that we do things with fewer and fewer resources. And all kinds of examples are cited of industries that have become more efficient in relation to their material input costs. And indeed, there's some evidence, and I'm going to look at the evidence in a minute, to suggest that some nations also, because they are advanced technological nations, have somehow managed to free themselves and already decoupled from the material impacts. Now, that, if it's true, is a really important argument. It's in favour of a technological optimism, but we do have to be absolutely clear that we agree the robustness of that evidence. And some of the evidence, I'll show you a couple of graphs in a minute, but it's also very important to distinguish between two different concepts of decoupling. One is relative decoupling, and the other is absolute decoupling. This is a little bit technical, but I just want to draw your attention. It's fairly straightforward to understand, and if you think about the intensity, resource intensity of $1 of economic activity. So let's say we're going to look at the carbon intensity of $1 of economic activity. So relative decoupling happens when the carbon intensity of each dollar of economic activity goes down and down and down. We're getting more efficient, essentially. And you look at the evidence and you say, yes, actually, globally, we have become around about 30% more efficient in carbon terms per dollar of economic activity than we were a couple of decades ago. That's great. That's fantastic. But what's happened to absolute carbon emissions? What is the level of absolute throughput? And in the same time, actually since 1990, carbon dioxide emissions globally have increased by 40%. So what's going on here? We're getting more efficient here, but actually carbon emissions have increased. And there are two things going on. One is the obvious balance between efficiency on the one hand and scale on the other. We're getting more efficient in terms of the intensity per dollar, but we're increasing the number of dollars of throughput, and the dollars outweigh the technological efficiency. Scale outweighs efficiency in almost all of the examples that you look at. And the second thing that's going on, which is a very interesting sort of phenomenon, is that you can't actually identify clearly that we have decoupled. Because one of the things that happens when you do things more efficiently is that you allow more activity, and more activity scales the impacts up even as efficiency pulls them down again. So that balance between efficiency and scale continues actually to haunt us and to lead to a situation in which ultimately we have failed to make progress against the Kyoto targets at the global level. So let me just show you a little bit of that failure. I mean, it's a very key lesson that the evidence of absolute decoupling, and you can look at it in carbon, you can look at it in resources, you can look at it in land, you can look at it in lots of places, is virtually absent. Okay, we didn't do so well. Perhaps we could do better in the future. Yes, of course. But, and here's another hard lesson, that the prospects for decoupling fast enough are ambitious at best. Here's a little bit of data. Here's all you need to see about these graphs, really, is that they go up. They're graphs of fossil fuel consumption against the world GDP. The top line is the world GDP. So you can see, because fossil fuel consumption lies below the line, that essentially means that we do see some relative decoupling. Although, if you look at, I'm not sure if you can see this little red light, you probably can't, but if you look at coal, for example, there in the later decade, it's increasing faster than GDP. In other words, we're becoming less efficient in global terms than we were before. So nothing very much there in the way of comfort that we've achieved, actually even relative decoupling. And here's another set of evidence. This is the extraction of metallic resources, and there you see the world GDP line is right clustered in the middle, and several of those lines are increasing quite a lot faster than GDP. So again, in resource productivity terms, we're going in the wrong direction. Okay, so we didn't do so well. Could we do better? How far do we have to go? And I'll just show this, again, as a simple visual image of the difference and the difficulty of the task ahead. And really all I want you to look at in this graph is the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And I'll explain what that difference is. Basically, this is where we are now. It's the carbon dioxide intensity per dollar of economic activity in 2007. 768 grams of carbon dioxide per dollar of economic activity. Ingrained in my mind from evenings on the spreadsheet through the production of Prosperity Without Growth. And where we need to be, if we really wanted an equal world, if we wanted a world in which 9 billion people could aspire to the income of the EU countries at the moment, with an added 2% growth along the way, is right down there on the far end at 6 grams of carbon per dollar of economic activity if we want a chance of getting under the IPCC targets for climate stabilisation. That's the scope of the task. And that's only 2050. So here is an economy that's going to grow another 3 times, possibly more, between 2050 and the end of the century. So by the end of the century, actually, well, under some scenarios, a hopeful scenario, you have to get down to 2 grams of carbon dioxide per dollar of economic activity. Under other scenarios, where we actually might need to be engaging in a faster stabilisation, you need an economy that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, that's a very interesting concept. It's certainly nothing like any kind of economy that we have ever seen. What is an economy that takes carbon out of the atmosphere? What does it run on? What's its resources? What's its fuels? How does it motor? How does it organize itself? How does it govern itself? All of these questions are really so profoundly difficult to answer under the existing model that people tend not to try and answer them. But they are, in fact, the logical consequence of a chain of reasoning that suggests that we can go on growing the economy and remain within ecological limits. So that's really where the evidence stands. Let's not for a minute fall into the trap of suggesting that there isn't a need for economic development in the developing countries. There's a quarter of the world's population without basic access to sanitation. There's 2 billion people living on less than $2 a day, the price of a cup of coffee. There is a need for economic development. Nobody's denying that. And let's also, for the sake of argument, let's admit that growth has done us some good, that we live in a civilized world, that we live in a place where health services are considerably better than they were, that our quality of life is better than it was decades ago. For the sake of argument, we should put all of those things on the table, and we could quite happily say yes, yes, yes to all of them. And yet it doesn't answer the question, how does that system continue to deliver an increasing quality of life, not just in the developed world, but in the poorer nations where it's desperately needed? So that's the basis of what Prosperity Without Growth is trying to do. That's the analysis which says it's difficult. The one key message that comes out of this, I think, is that actually you can't really tackle that issue without confronting the structure of the existing economy. And so that's one of the things that Prosperity Without Growth tries to do. I'm going to slightly heroically throw a little bit of that structure to you in a very simplified way. A lot is spoken about the engine of growth. Here's a little bit of what the engine of growth looks like. Firms produce goods for households, and they also provide them with incomes through employing them in households, and households spend those incomes buying more goods. That's a fantastically neat way of organising activity, and it seems to have been fairly successful. There's nothing in the diagram at the moment that suggests that it has to grow and grow and grow, but actually the dynamics does become a bit more complicated. The other things that consumers do with their incomes is, if you're lucky, although not much in the UK, save. But certainly one of the things that has to happen is firms have to invest. They have to invest in just maintaining their productive capacity. But being as we are in an economy in which the profit motive matters, They also invest in improvements, in continual technological improvements. And those are potentially quite good things because they increase the productivity with which those goods are produced. And in the process of increasing productivity, they lower the cost of the goods. And so, all other things being equal, we would like to buy more of something that is cheaper. The other thing that investment does for firms is it allows them to continually reconceive their own processes and products, to produce novelty continually. And this was a point that was made quite strongly by Joseph Schumpeter in the 1930s, 40s. The idea of creative destruction, that this process of continually throwing over the old processes, bringing in the new processes, producing new products, is an important part of what it means to keep an economy going. And again, novelty is something that we as households, as it turns out, prize. And so it also tempts us to buy more stuff and pumps the economy in the way that you want it to go. Now, the interesting aspect of that production of novelty up there is it has a lovely, neat match with our own desire for novelty. The consumption of novelty by households plays critical roles in our sort of rather complex social logic, what it means to live in society. One of those roles is an obvious one, the one around positional consumption. So the idea that novelty sends signals to those around us that we occupy a good place in society, that we have high status in society, is one of the things that novelty feeds. It also feeds all kinds of other things. One of them is our dreams and aspirations, that something is new and continually turned over somehow does suggest to us a form of progress. So this production and consumption of novelty, I'm not passing a judgment here. All I'm saying essentially is that these two things are perfect partners for each other. The production of novelty by firms has an inherent partner in the consumption of novelty by households, and that is a deeply entwined economic and social logic that's really important to making this system work. There's another interesting feature of it, which is that it's driven to some extent by anxiety. The anxiety of the firm is that capital will fly from the firm if you're not continually innovating, if you're not at the margins of what is the production of novelty. And the consumption of households goes back to a very interesting thing that Adam Smith once talked about when he was writing about economics 250 years ago, and he talked about the ability to go out in public without shame. What is it? What's the basket of commodities? What's the bundle of goods that we need in order to go out in public without shame? Adam Smith talked about. And in his day it was a linen shirt. In our day it's a whole range of other commodities that contribute to this idea of a life without shame. So a life without shame is in one sense a very honourable and very humanising version of what we're doing as consumers, and in another has the seeds of anxiety sown within it. So it's a system driven by this coupling of economic structure and social logic, driven to some extent by anxiety, and expanded continually over the last decade and a half, particularly by structures of credit and debt, which feed that flow through the system. And it's one of the things, obviously, that went wrong. It's a very good system for all sorts of reasons, except for when liquidity stalls and consumer confidence drops. And then the risk is that this thing, which drives itself nicely in that circle in a relatively stable way, comes untucked, comes untangled, and becomes deeply unstable. The other thing, of course, that's deeply wrong with this model is it has no sense of the resource implications of that particular economic structure. So there's structure. That's to head that off. I mean, it is a very complex territory. I think the important thing to note to it is how this system has worked quite well in the past, but has taken not enough context of limits and hasn't really understood the way in which the social logic is coupled with the economic structure itself. So we're there, that's complexity. We seem to be almost socially locked in. We're looking at kind of almost beginning to look like impossibility theorems for sustainability. Where is the progress that can be made here? And one of the things that's been very interesting about prosperity without growth is this kind of sense that of being pulled into impossibility theorems and pulled into places which look intractable. And there's many, many prophets of intractability at every stage. The economy has to work this because this is how economies work. Social logic has to be like this because we're born like that. We have innate qualities. The banking system has to work like that because we have to expand the monetary supply. And indeed government itself, the government itself is almost unable to act in the face of these because it has a democratic mandate which it can't go against. And one of the interesting things to me, and I hope it comes out in the report, is that at every stage, actually when you begin to unpack the assumptions of intractability, there is room for manoeuvre. So the rest of the report, and what I will very briefly trot through really, is options for untangling that intractability. And I'll concentrate really on two. One is about economic structure and the other is around social logic. So the economic structure one is fairly straightforward, and it's the biggest call in a way from the report, is to say actually we need a different kind of macroeconomics, because actually all our economic theory from the 1930s onwards talks about economic stability in terms of consumption growth. If we want to do something differently, we have to reinvent the way that we approach macroeconomics. And here's just really a couple of suggestions for that route. One is that an economy isn't just consumption. It isn't just about consumption growth, it's also about investment. So a key element in the new macroeconomics is suggesting different balances between consumption and investment. And that's come to the fore actually in the Green New Deal work, because the whole point about the Green New Deal, the whole point about public policy in a recession is, in order to keep the economy going, in order to get it back on track, why not put some money to investment? The Green New Deal concept says, put that investment where we need it for a transition to a sustainable economy. So that's a really interesting concept. So let's invest in low-carbon technologies, let's invest in public infrastructures that support public transport, let's invest in resource productivity, let's invest in energy efficiency, let's invest in adaptation perhaps, let's invest in ecological enhancement. A whole concept, a new raft of targets for investment, the investments that are needed to create the transition to a sustainable economy. So that's, once you start to untangle that balance and get this idea that investment is absolutely key, then it gives you somewhere to go. But it also forces you to ask some questions, because this kind of investment doesn't work the way the old investment markets worked. And this is a key point really to make, that there's a different investment ecology associated with this kind of investment. So the periods of return tend to be different, often longer. The rates of return tend to be different, sometimes lower. The targets themselves are not often able to compete in existing capital markets because of a focus on short-run, high-return investment, and the fact that that is the marker for how investment return is made. So the idea that you need a different kind of investment goes along with the idea that you need a different ecology of investment. You cannot leave capital markets intact and expect them to deliver this profile of investment. And in particular, one of the things that comes clear is that actually there may be a very good case here for public investment, a public investment case that has been to some extent shunned in the last 20 to 30 years, and particularly in relation to the ownership of those assets, particularly revenue-producing assets, as public investments, has not been seen, I would say, as a very favourable strategy in the last 20 to 30 years. And interestingly, one of the things that's come out of the financial crisis is quite definitely that balance has now changed. There is now a language, and it does owe something, interestingly, to number 10, around the argument that actually if we are going to bail out certain sectors or industries, then it's fair enough to ask for a return on that investment. And essentially that is an argument for public ownership of assets in the public good. And there are other examples as well where you can say that that change has taken place. So it's a really important thing to look at. Generally speaking, the balance between private affluence and public goods, the idea of social goods, the idea of public investment in the social good is a core new dimension to an economics of sustainability. And of course, such an economics also has to be ecologically literate. That sort of goes without saying. Okay, we fixed the economy. Let's move on to the social logic. The social logic, of course, isn't any easier. But again, here, intractability seems too harsh a course. I love this picture. More leisure and entertainment upstairs. It's a shopping mall somewhere. All this and heaven too seems to be the implication of that. And counter to that, I think it's interesting to point to these ideas, back to my chair, of a simpler kind of conception of what well-being, of what prosperity, of what the good life means. And I have been looking, I mean, in my work on sustainable consumption, I've continually come back to this question: is it possible to live better by consuming less? And one of the things that's clear is there's lots of people who think it is. So there is out there what Kate Soper, one of the contributors to some of the work in Prosperity Without Growth, calls an alternative hedonism. It's not about hair, shirts and sacrifice. It is about actually ways of living better, which are not so prone to individualistic materialism and rampant consumerism. And that idea of an alternative hedonism has been cashed out. I mean, there are very good examples of it. Again, a lot of the work in my research group has been looking at some of these places. And inherent in these places is the idea of prosperity. It's a different idea of prosperity. It isn't largely income-based. It's around the concept of human flourishing that draws a lot from people like Amartya Sen, who've talked about what it means to flourish. And they have been played out in, if you like, all kinds of places, but one in what I would call here intentional communities. Places where people have taken it in their heads, really, to live in more sustainable ways, to live more simple ways, to introduce a different kind of ethic, to live more in harmony with their environment. Now, I am not suggesting to you that there is a simple model here that can be translated to the mainstream. And yet it is clear that this is a model that we should be looking at quite closely, both in terms of its success in people living a different kind of life, and also in terms of the obstacles that they confront. And from our research, one of the strongest things we find, actually, is that these people are, they do have some identifiable differences. They do have different value sets. They are more pro-environmental. They're sometimes more altruistic. They are, interestingly, in some of the data, happier living this way. Often, though, they don't necessarily have a lower environmental impact. They don't differ in their behaviours that much from you guys, from me, from the ordinary people on the street. And the one defining characteristic, and it kind of shocked me when I came across this, was that actually what characterises these kinds of communities is a sense of struggle, a sense of conflict, because these are people who have chosen to live in ways which are distinct from the social norm, in which they situate themselves outside existing infrastructures, where they get out of their car and step onto sidewalks that are too narrow and too crowded and too crossed with traffic lanes, in which there is no cycling facility, in which the way that they would like to handle their material goods is not accounted for, is not catered for, and indeed the way in which they would like to present their lives and the values that they would like to pursue through their lives are not valued around them. So they are living to some extent in conflict with their own social structure. And this is it's a deeply uncomfortable place to be. It's an odd place for someone to choose to be, because one of the aspects of prosperity is actually the ability to participate in society. And if you're deliberately creating a situation for yourself where you're somehow divorcing yourself from social norms and trying to work a different kind of life, you obviously face a sort of threat to your prosperity. And the way that these people negotiate that is very interesting as well, by creating sort of alternative meaning structures. But the lesson for this, for any more general attempt to build a different kind of prosperity, is that this kind of change cannot happen without structural change. It cannot happen without different physical infrastructures. It cannot happen without different social infrastructures. It can't happen in the context in which all the consumer signals point us continually towards a moral duty to get out on the high street and shop. These social signals, this set of social signals and institutions and structures militate against the possibility of this route. And they call for really a huge investment. Again, it's a different kind of investment. It does to some extent coincide with the need for investment in the macroeconomy, but it's an investment in capabilities. It's an investment in social flourishing, in the ability to live better by consuming less, a different way of participating in society, a different way of creating the conditions of flourishing. So those again, I mean, that's no easy wins here, but is the sense that there are places to go. I'm not going to talk too much about government. There's an interesting point about governance that we may get to in the discussion. But one of the key findings really is that government itself is deeply conflicted, and for some fairly obvious reasons, that they do want to protect ecological and social goals. They have a mandate to do so, and yet they also have a mandate to maintain social stability. So if you live in an economic model in which economic stability depends on growth and social stability depends on economic stability, then arguably it's legitimate for government to defend continually economic growth. And yet clearly the conflict between those two positions puts government itself in a difficult position. And my rather heroic assumption or claim is that actually the space to change that lies precisely in creating the conditions for economic and social stability that don't demand a growth-based model. So that's a point that we can discuss in more detail. I really want to just stop there really with some final thoughts. It all comes down to three very, very simple things at the end of the day. And Prosperity with Growth's three messages are: establish the limits, make those limits a part of the architecture of the system, fix the economics, what could be more simple than that, and invest in social change, invest in capabilities for flourishing, build capabilities for flourishing, a better life. That idea of intractability, I think, is not a very helpful one. In all of the areas that we've looked at, there are avenues for change. They're not easy avenues for change, but they create a sense of possibility, and certainly, I would argue, a better place to be than one that is mired in the collapse of a system which finally has not worked to create flourishing in great, vast swathes of the population, and is now meeting its match in an economic crisis bigger than anything we've seen for several decades. So the promise of prosperity without growth is ultimately very simple, that another world is possible. Thank you very much.